Thank you very much, Umberto, and it's a great pleasure to speak to you here this afternoon. I stand between you and dinner, so I thought I wasn't going to try and summarize the paper, which is very long, but rather pick out a few of the main proposals I was trying to develop in it. And so what I will do in the presentation in the next half an hour or so, hopefully shorter than that, will be in three parts. I'll talk about civil economy, civil politics, and constitutional reforms. That will be the first part. Then about mutualizing the market and building a more ethical economy with some examples in the second. And finally, pluralizing politics and the state with some examples in the third and final part. But before I start, it might be worth just making a few preliminary remarks about the paper and sort of what lies behind it. And I suppose the first point I'd want to make is that it's very much not about Cartesian, clear and distinct ideas. It's very much about recognizing that there's an ambivalence involved in all ideas and practices. You know, rights, individual rights, they can be liberating, but they can also be instruments of oppression. Right? Communities can be forms of solidarity or they can be forms of atomization. Right, so all of the notions we're using, including the common good, including the gift, involve some ambivalence. They also involve some asymmetry. Some forms of relationality are more reciprocal than others. Right, so what I want to avoid is just using any of these terms in very generic ways. I hope sometimes I can add some nuance to them. And I think virtue is such an important concept because virtue in and of itself, as Aristotle already taught, is a middle ground. It's precisely trying to hold a very delicate position between extremes, between either an excess or a deficiency. So courage is the middle ground between cowardice and recklessness. Right? So virtue already is something that tries to keep a certain balance, and I think that is absolutely vital to what I'm going to try and say, because I think much of what it is to transform state, market, and civil society institutions today is about creating a greater and better balance of interests so that people can actually work together for something like the common good. And the common good is something I would define in the following terms. The common good is both individual fulfillment and mutual flourishing. So it is about the person, it is about the freedom and the dignity of each and every one, but it's precisely a form of goodness that can only be obtained in relationship with others. Now, relationships themselves involve power, they can involve wealth, they can involve social status, but relationships are primary. They're more fundamental than rights or contracts. And so I want to, in some sense, preface my remarks by saying that what I'm going to be presenting is very much about the primacy of interpersonal relationships, which again can be a good thing or of course can also be a bad thing. So the ambivalence of relationships is something again I want to stress very much. The other thing I want to stress is that of course there is a historical and cultural context to each and every country in every case, and so in no sense am I going to be proposing anything like a one-size-fits-all model. The whole reason why the so-called Washington consensus of neoliberal economics is not working is because it's assumed that somehow there is only one model which can be applied everywhere. And so the whole point about Catholic social teaching is to take historical and cultural contingency seriously. And so therefore, not everything that I am proposing applies to all places at all times. And the third and final sort of remark at the beginning is about essentially how we can build these new alliances for change that can transform state, market, and civil society. And I think we're at least in a position to say what won't work. What won't work is a single ideology, because all of the modern ideologies, liberalism, conservatism, socialism, are all in disarray. And we can see from the state of political parties that these ideologies are simply not responding to our contemporary needs and our interests. But nor can we just hope that certain sectional interests, certain vested interests will do the job. Rather, what we need to be doing is linking very real, concrete needs to some shared interests with view to the common good as I've defined it, individual fulfillment and mutual flourishing. And it's very clear, and I think this point became clearer to me as I was listening to Jeffrey Sachs, it's very clear that the churches, faith communities, people of no faith, but that basically all sorts of intermediary institutions can be the driving force for these new alliances. We can't rely on state or market institutions to do it, nor can we sit back and hope that civil society in its present configuration can do it. But I think the churches, other faith traditions around the world, lots and lots of people of goodwill can be persuaded to work together to create a new set of practices. So let me then turn to the first part. Civil economy and civil politics. I thought it was useful in the paper briefly to distinguish 4 different models, only because they give us a sense, I think, of where we are today as well. In these 4 models, I will summarize very, very briefly. One model of civil society is basically saying that the state is always more fundamental than civil society or the market. And this we could trace to Machiavelli, Hobbes, Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, right? A long tradition of Western thought. It's a sort of, if you like, the statist model. Right? The state is the most fundamental, it's at the beginning of the social contract, and so on. The second model is basically saying that the market is the most fundamental institution, and this would be traced to Locke, and then we could trace it to neoclassical economics all the way to neoliberalism today. Somehow the commercial republic, if you like, in the American sense, is kind of the most primary way in which human beings relate to one another. Let's call that market fundamentalism. Right, in terms of where we are today. The third one is basically seeing civil society as separate from state and market. And this would be, if you like, something we could attribute to the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Ferguson, Adam Smith. Yes, it's there, it's important, but it's not really the same as the invisible hand of the market or the visible hand of the state. And then the fourth model, which is, I think, the one that is of greatest interest to us, is the idea that actually civil life is more primary than either the economy or the polity. That is to say, all the complex relationships that constitute society are actually at the root. And civil society institutions, as well as state and market institutions, are in some sense a reflection of those fundamental interpersonal relationships. Key to that fourth model is the principle of human association, that human beings don't live in isolation, but that rather that they associate with each other around certain shared ends. Right? From the family all the way up to professions, faith communities, and so on. And that intermediary institutions, on the whole, tend to mediate and tend to limit state and market power. Right? And there's a very wide range of thinkers that I think has helped us to conceptualize this. In France, Montesquieu, Constant, Guizot, Tocqueville, and there are lots of others. But of course, in the case of civil economy, in particular, Paolo Mattia Doria and Antonio Genovesi. And this is not just of historical interest, it matters today because that civil economy tradition is so central to Caritas in Veritate and to Catholic social teaching today. So this isn't just for a historical record, this matters because these models are the ones we are dealing with today. But where are we today? I think it's fair enough to say that we still use categories that don't quite capture our experience. Right? We tend to think of state, market, and civil society as somehow 3 separate spheres, right? And one of which will be the one that is more essential than the others. But that doesn't really work because what we're seeing at the moment is one process of dispossession and domination. I think it's fair enough to say that we are living through times where in different contexts around the world we are seeing a centralization of power, a concentration of wealth, and a commodification of everyday life. Yes, that's a very general statement, but I think that applies to most, if not all, places. And I think a way to understand this is in terms of domination and dispossession. An awful lot of people feel that they're being dominated by forces that they have absolutely no control over, and that they're being dispossessed, not just in the purely economic sense, but also in the sense of being dispossessed of certain ways of life, of certain identities. And I think Karl Polanyi in The Great Transformation offered us a very good way of conceptualizing this. Because, of course, he spoke about the disembedding of the economy and politics from society. That was one movement that he observed in the history of modernity. And then the embedding of social relations within monetary transactions and administrative processes. Okay, so first, in some sense, the economy gets taken out of society and politics, and then everything is put back into economic transactions and administrative processes. And this is precisely what Pope Benedict XVI captures when he writes something I quoted yesterday in one of my comments. This is what he writes in Caritas in Veritate, article 39, paragraph 39 rather. The exclusively binary model of state, of market plus state, is corrosive of society, while economic forms based on solidarity, which find a natural home in civil society without being restricted to it, build up society. So Pope Benedict is very clear that what we're seeing is a convergence of state and market forces at the expense of society. But crucially, he also says that solidarity, in the Catholic sense of interpersonal lived solidarity, is something which isn't just restricted to civil society, it can also apply to state and market. So how could one re-inject solidarity into state and market, as well as protect it in the realm of civil society? Well, before I get to some of the more concrete proposals, let me just say that what's really crucial to realize is that there's a whole different anthropology at work, and a number of speakers have already alluded to this. And the anthropology that I think is at work in Catholic social thought is one where we're always already social animals. This is different from the legacy of antiquity, because, as you might know, Aristotle said we are political beings. Thomas Aquinas went a step further and said we are social beings. It's not just that we're born into political structures, we are always already born into social relations. And these social relations, however problematic, are essentially how we learn to love and care for family, for neighbors, for colleagues, for friends, for fellow citizens. Right? They create, if you like, a form of attachment, and they create forms of affection. Of course, there are all sorts of examples of dysfunctional relations, but it doesn't take away from the anthropological point that we're always already born into relationships and institutions which command our affections and which also create some form of attachment. And if we don't understand that, then I think we start in the wrong place. You know the famous joke about Ireland, when people travel around and want to go from Limerick to Dublin and ask the local farmer, how do we get to Dublin? And he says, I can't do the Irish accent, so I won't try. He says, well, sir, I wouldn't start from here. That's the whole point. If we start with the wrong anthropology, we surely end up with the wrong economic and political models. And part of what it is to talk about public affection and attachment, public because it's not just private, it's not just about the individual, him or herself, it's about how we live in society, is to get a greater balance of interest, and that includes a greater balance of contract with gift and rights with obligations. Again, I think Caritas in Veritate is very, very clear about the need to think very carefully about just how central obligations and duties are to us. Because we always start with rights and entitlements nowadays, and that, I think, already limits our imagination. Just one more quote from Caritas in Veritate before I proceed. Pope Benedict writes this: the link consists in this: individual rights, when detached from a framework of duties which grants them their full meaning, can run wild, leading to an escalation of demands which is effectively unlimited and indiscriminate. An overemphasis on rights leads to a disregard for duties. Duties set a limit on rights because they point to the anthropological and ethical framework of which rights are a part. In this way, ensuring that they do not become license. Duties thereby reinforce rights and call for their defense and promotion as a task to be undertaken in the service of the common good. End of quote. This is paragraph 43 of Caritas in Veritate. Very interesting. If you only focus on rights and entitlements, you end up losing rights and entitlements, because you can only secure them by having a proper balance with duties. And I think that's something that's worth remembering as we consider how to transform state, market, and civil society. So what does that mean in more concrete terms? first set of reforms that I would want to put forward for our discussion. One is a greater constitutional recognition of communities, groups, and associations. Obviously, only those which are democratically self-governed, otherwise we would be giving license to mafias and other criminal organizations. So only groups, associations, and communities that are compatible with the wider constitutional order and which are democratically self-governed, by which I mean representing the interests of their members and being accountable to them. And that already allows us to criticize organizations which are very top-down and disregard their members. A lot of trade unions, sadly, are dominated by trade union bosses or barons and take little account of workers. Right? Just like a lot of big businesses are run in the interests of top managers and shareholders and not enough of the interests of workers, suppliers, and others. Second idea is to associate communities, groups, and associations to more public political debate and even some decision-making. That could be consultation, but it could also be by giving them some kind of political role, maybe creating other forms of representation, not just political representation where one person has one vote, but perhaps also upper chambers of parliament at different levels, where you could be representing cities, regions, but also professions and faith groups. Only so that we can basically have a constitutional order that actually represents people in different ways, because we are not just represented by being individual citizens who vote for parties. That's a very impoverished model of representation. We can be represented in different ways, as members of communities, as members of professions. And I think it requires a constitutional recognition. And then connecting rights and entitlements with obligation and duties. For instance, when it comes to welfare. Welfare is, of course, on one level a right and an entitlement, especially for those in dire need. But there's also a contributory element to welfare. There's also a sense in which those who've contributed for years and for decades, right, and perhaps that they do generally deserve a little bit more help than those who've not contributed or only contributed for a short period. I find it scandalous in the UK that people who've contributed for 30, 40 years then find themselves unemployed and get the same £36 a week than people who've not contributed or who've only worked for a year. That, to me, is not a form of justice in the substantive sense. There's something fundamentally unfair about this. So I think we need to recognize that contribution is an essential part. Some people can't contribute at some point and still deserve all of our help. But many people who do contribute, I think, deserve greater recognition for that. Let me move on to the next part, which is about mutualizing the market and building an ethical economy. I think there are two fundamental problems, again, which we can observe in many places around the world. One is that we have monopolies and cartels rather than open competitive markets. All right? In the year 2017, 2/3 of the 900 sectors that we can roughly survey exhibit a greater concentration of ownership and control than in 1997. So over the last 20 years, we've seen an increase in the concentration of ownership and control, not an increase in competition. And on the whole, what this does is it does distort prices, it distorts consumer choice, and it also often doesn't help the quality of products and services. And that is true for banking, as it is true for water, as it is true for other sectors. And then, of course, we have the new big tech platforms, which are really modern-day plutocracies. They have such dominant market positions that there's no talk about competition. In fact, quite the opposite. These big tech companies take over their online competitors and also now beginning to take over the real retailers in the world of shops. So Amazon buys World Food, right, and so on and so forth. And moreover, they manage access to information and knowledge and thereby, in fact, control public debate in ways that threaten not just open markets, but also free speech. So we can say that plutocratic power undermines both economic competition and democracy. So that's one problem. The other problem is that we have a system that encourages and rewards privatization of profit, nationalization of losses, and socialization of risks. That's the fundamental economic model we had before the financial crash, and it's one that we have now. Now, I do talk in the paper about incentives and rewards. I think it's probably too technical for now. I'll come back to it perhaps in the discussion, but basically what I would say is that we have a system that essentially suffers from a number of problems. I'll just mention two for the moment. One is that we separate ex ante motivation from ex post outcomes. Right? We do not think of them as, in some sense, related. So what we actually have is a perverse situation where we're now rewarding failure. If someone runs a bank into the ground, they'll walk off with a golden handshake. And you kind of think, why are we rewarding failure? This seems economically, not just ethically perverse. And we also, I think, privilege self-interest and see social benefit as merely some sort of unintended consequence. So I think what we really need to think is how we can think together economic profit and social purpose, how we can think together motivation, which is both intrinsic and external. Again, it comes back to anthropology. Do we think people are fundamentally selfish and greedy, or do we think that they actually are self-regarding as well as other-regarding? And I think that's the main challenge, to design institutions and practices that reinforce a sense of self-interest, but also a sense of interest for others and for the common good. Some of the market reforms, and I won't mention all of them. Given that debt still remains one of the key problems, I think we need to think of debt in far more relational terms. Debt isn't just some kind of external reality. Debt is obviously tied in with assets, and we think of debt as now more fundamental than assets, which, if you like to use an analogy from Augustine, means that we are effectively treating debt like if it was real in its own terms, like if evil had its own reality. But no, evil, as we know from Augustine, is a privation of the good. So what is debt? Debt is in some sense linked to assets. There can only be debts because they're assets in the first place. And assets will always exceed debts. But we are now in an economic system where debts are destroying assets. And that can't be right. So we need to think about writing off debt. Debt forgiveness remains a key challenge. We need to think about restructuring it. And we need to think about converting some debt into equity. Because otherwise we will not break the cycle where more and more debt will keep on destroying more and more of people's assets. Right. We need to promote risk and profit-sharing arrangements so that we don't have a separation of profit from risk, but rather managers' bonuses and their wealth should be on the line when they take risks. It can't be the case that someone can isolate their own wealth from risk-taking. That can't be right, because then they're basically gambling with other people's assets. So surely some form of risk and profit sharing is important. And then I think transforming corporate governance, not just representing owners and top management, but also giving a greater role to workers, suppliers, consumers, and perhaps even local communities where businesses operate. Just to give a couple of concrete examples, when it comes to public corporations, we could have tripartite structures. For train companies, managers, workers, and passengers, the three parties that are interested, they need to all have a voice so that we don't manage trains just in the interest of one or two of them. Hospitals, funders, doctors and nurses, and patients. Right? Or schools, local government, teachers, and parents. In each case, we could create tripartite structures so that a greater balance of interest is secured. Let me move on to the final part, pluralizing politics and the state. Much of the modern nation state is very centralizing and very top-down. So much so that basically the modern state, while certainly providing some form of progress and in the form of liberties and opportunities, has also essentially subordinated all intermediary institutions to its control. And more recently, in the age of globalization, has opened up all other institutions to global forces, so that we find ourselves often as isolated individuals, not really being able to shape things around us, because the state has not just a monopoly on the use of physical force, as Max Weber said, but now has a monopoly on all sorts of other things. Since the French Revolution, the state controls what counts as an intermediary institution and what doesn't. Right? Not in all countries. In some countries, medieval legacies survive, like in Italy and parts of Germany, but the French state abolished all intermediary institutions at the time of the revolution, then recreated them under its own aegis, meaning that the state has all control, and individuals are essentially left atomized. So in order to have a greater form of pluralism, one thing is the constitutional reforms I mentioned at the beginning, giving groups, communities, associations greater constitutional status. The Italian constitution in the post-war era actually does that very explicitly. I think the German constitution does so through a federal structure. Other countries don't, and I think maybe there's something to learn out. The UK is actually one of the most, if not the single most centralized country in the European Union until March 19 when it leaves, but it will remain one of the most centralized countries in the world because it doesn't have any meaningful local government and it doesn't have any participation of workers, of universities and so on in its general governance. And why does this matter? Why is it important to provide a greater plurality? Because actually a lot of state services will be much better delivered if we involve people. People have a lot more knowledge about their needs and their interests than central government ever could. Now that doesn't mean that we can decentralize, never mind privatize everything, no, but it means that where people's knowledge can make a contribution, it should always be possible to do so. So when it comes, for instance, to things like healthcare or social care, we still deliver a one-size-fits-all service to people with very different needs. And that's especially true for mental health and for social care. Whereas actually there are now interesting initiatives around sort of membership-based groups, where you have perhaps a personal budget, which you can take to a membership-based group, and then basically choose that group according to your needs, and that group will be local, it will know about your neighborhood, it will probably even know you, you will know them, and it provides a much more personalized service than anything the state at high levels can provide. The advantage of membership-based groups at the local level is that you're cutting out the middleman. You're cutting out all sorts of layers, which are very often about control and not really about the delivery of services. The gatekeepers, right, the bureaucrats, the people who assess you endlessly, whether you're fit to work or whether you need this or that, it's simply not needed. In the health service in Britain, most of the investment under the new Labour government has gone into management and accountancy, not into frontline. And this is why the central state is so ill-equipped to provide for our genuine needs and to actually let relationships develop. I think we need to think much more about training, so that training becomes genuinely something that is about our fulfillment and about our creativity, not just training so we can get a job so that we don't receive welfare. In other words, a purely instrumental approach will only ever lead to something very impoverished. If you create institutions where people can pursue creative activities, train in meaningful ways that gives them real skills and knowledge, then I think you also generally create the conditions for a better employment situation rather than a very, as I said, impoverished sort of model. And this could apply to things like mutual jobs fund that I talk about a bit in the paper, where you could have, again, different stakeholders involved. You could have some financing from central government, some from local businesses. Local government could be more involved, and it could be much more about apprenticeships and through-life training rather than what we have at the moment, where central government, in some sense, monopolizes so much of our welfare and our social security. Let me wrap up because time is short. One of the questions that might arise is, well, that's all very well and good, but how do we go about this? And that takes me back to the beginning, which is, it's very much about building new alliances. And I think one of the guiding principles can be genuinely the idea of shared interest, because the assumption that we all have competing individual interests that we can't reconcile is, I think, anthropologically false. And it can also be about looking to some creative minorities, as Pope Benedict called them, that can actually take forward a lot of initiatives at their own level. And then it's about, I think, the churches together exercising or providing far more leadership so that we don't think that state, market, and civil society are the only institutions at our disposal. The churches have enormous economic, political, and cultural capital. And I think it's time that that capital was used in the best sense of the word, creating the spaces so that people can associate, you know, and I think we heard from other presentations already about how some of this can be done. I'm thinking of Professor Bacchetti's presentation earlier. So let me leave it there, and I look forward to the comments. Thank you very much.